My name is Eli Carter, and I learned early on that some things in life are practical, and some things are sacred. My dad's old Chevy was both. It wasn't a show truck, it was the kind of truck that smelled like oil and sun and the inside of a barn, the kind of truck that held a lifetime of small, ordinary memories. The dent from a deer he swore was someone else's fault, the chipped paint where mom dropped a can of enamel on a Saturday, the radio knob that always stuck on AM. When he died, they told me to sell it, to move on, to be reasonable. I told them to go to hell and parked it in my garage, and honestly, if you've ever had something that belonged to someone you loved, you get why that was never negotiable. 3 sentences is supposed to be enough to hook someone, so here's the first 3. The HOA called it an eyesore. The HOA sent a tow truck to the driveway at midnight, and the woman in charge of the HOA looked at my truck like it owed her money. That's how this whole thing started, not with a lawsuit or a dramatic showdown, but with a clipboard and a gold seal sticker and a woman who'd apparently decided our little cul-de-sac should be run like a private country club. We live in Willowbrook Downs cookie-cutter houses, a community pool with more rules than actual water, and sidewalks that have become the full-time office for people who like to police other people's lawns. It's the sort of place where the HOA newsletter has clauses about potted plants. The president's name was Evelyn Hart, mid-50s, white hair done just enough to stay in command, and a smile that could sharpen into a warning when she wanted it to. She wore blazers like they were armor, and had this way of speaking as if she were reading the bylaws aloud while sentencing someone. People who didn't bother the HOA thought she was civic-minded. People who did well, they had a different word for it. I wasn't someone who woke up every morning trying to stir a neighborhood drama. I worked nights doing IT support, and my days were a quiet diet of coffee, small repairs, and streaming baseball when I could. The truck was my tether back to a father who liked fixing things until the whole job was done. So when I saw the tow lights in my driveway at midnight, I stood in my kitchen with the deadbolt between me and a man with a clipboard and realized the rest of my life was about to get complicated for the next few months. Evelyn claimed we were violating a community standard long-term vehicle storage on the driveway, the old chestnut. Technically, she was right if you interpreted the rule like the HOA lawyer would like you to. 1 car must be in the garage, 1 in the driveway, no recreational unregistered vehicles, blah blah. Technically, she'd also forged a smile while telling my neighbor on the phone that she'd given us fair warning. In reality, she'd sent a tow operator who didn't ask questions and left me in the dark watching my dad's truck get hooked up while Evelyn read off a form like she'd just performed civic surgery. The sheriff arrived because my neighbor called him a good man named Roy, who rolls slow and listens faster. He asked Evelyn to pause until morning and take the argument to the board at the next meeting. Evelyn's jaw tightened. She told Sheriff Roy that rules are rules, and some people need to be reminded of that. She had the sort of conviction that can paper over sympathy. The tow driver left reluctantly. The truck stayed, and my anger dissolved into an itch I couldn't scratch until I knew why Evelyn had it in for me. Over the next few weeks, it shifted from petty to purposeful. The official notices arrived in cream envelopes with embossed seals, not exactly forgeries, but close enough to look official on first glance. There were citations for an unapproved flag in my yard, for a mailbox that was not in keeping with community aesthetics, for a wind chime that apparently produced unapproved sonic distress. Then Evelyn started escalating in ways that weren't quite legitimate. A man who introduced himself as a property investigator showed up at odd hours asking questions about where I kept the truck keys, and someone once tried to cut the chain to the gate between my garage and the alley in the dead of night. The sheriff wrote reports. The investigators' invoices turned up online in a way that linked back to services associated with Evelyn's board. At first it felt like harassment. Then it felt like a campaign. People are complicated, and motives are rarely simple. With Evelyn, there was more than one rope pulling at the center of her behavior. She believed in order that, in a way, was laudable. She also believed in control, and control mixes badly with grudges. There were whispered things about her husband wanting the pool remodeled to a certain design and neighbors who had snubbed her at an event 2 years prior. Maybe the truck symbolized something to her, a piece of an identity she decided didn't belong in Willowbrook Downs. Or maybe she just liked to win. Human beings like stories where villains have cartoon motives, but usually the villain truly thinks, that they're doing the right thing. Evelyn's righteousness was that kind of dangerous, righteous enough to weaponize the board. When the power went out one night in the middle of a thunderstorm, because of course it did, I sat in my garage, listening to the wind slap against the siding and thinking about the way my father used to hum while he tightened a bolt. The DVR on my security camera clicked off like a metronome would stop, one long, recorded silence that felt louder than the storm. For a second I reconsidered everything. Maybe this was all absurd. Maybe the truck wasn't worth the headache. Maybe I should sell it and walk away. Then my neighbor, Kayla, who had an old Labrador and a laugh that could make you feel seen, popped her head over the fence at dawn. "Did you check the camera?" she asked, like it was a rhetorical question. I hadn't. The power was out, the recorder dead. But I walked through the garage and down the path to the alley where the gate was half pried, and something in the mud caught my eye. Tire tracks, too deliberate, with a tread that matched an unmarked van I'd seen cruising late at night, the kind of van with no logos and windows painted to black. Kayla had noticed it too, and together we realized the outage might not have been random. We finished the generator fix myself. Dad taught me enough about old engines that I could coax it into life, and the DVR popped back on like a blinking stubborn eye. There on the footage, from the night before, was the van pulling up, someone stepping out with a flashlight and a prying tool, and a person who looked like Evelyn watching from her car across the street, hands folded like a director at the end of a performance. The footage wasn't cinematic, it was grainy, a smear of dark and light, but it told a story that didn't fit the HOA script. It told a story of orchestration. The sheriff's office took it seriously enough to file a report. Roy looked at the clip twice, like he needed the second viewing to catch the insidiousness of it. "We can't arrest someone on that alone," he said. "But we can watch. And if anything happens again, we'll be ready." He had that patient, certain tone that's basically the job description for small-town law enforcement. I wanted to punch the air because I wanted to do anything, but the sheriff saying, "We'll watch," is as close as you get to a promise in these things. It's also where most stories either fizzle or ignite. We decided to make it ignite. Not with revenge or arson or any of the dumb ideas that look good after midnight tequila with planning. Sheriff Roy and I and Kayla and a few other neighbors started talking strategy in the daylight, in living rooms that smelled of coffee and dog hair. We were careful not to plan crimes. We planned to document crimes. That's a legal and moral line. You can't set up a trap that creates wrongdoing, but you can set up conditions where illegal action reveals itself. It's the difference between planting a bait and leaving the door unlocked in the hope someone will break in. One is legal, the other is complicity. Evelyn, of course, played her role perfectly. Every board meeting she ran like a courtroom, and a matinee rolled into one. She would stand at the lectern, hands folded, and talk about community standards while flashing those cream envelopes like religious relics. She had supporters, people who liked a tidy neighborhood and liked to feel like they were on the right side of enforcement. The board was small, and the board gave her cover. That's leadership. To get the crowd to clap loud enough and they won't look at the hands in your pockets. We set up a decoy, not to bait anyone into crime, but to create a situation where the truth would be obvious if Evelyn attempted to escalate. Had the sheriff not been involved, I would have been more nervous. With him, we had legal oversight. The decoy was a cheap, beaten-up sedan, not my dad's truck, parked plainly in the driveway, clearly visible, with a sign we taped to the windshield. Community notice pending, do not tow. It was the opposite of subtle, and that was the point. If Evelyn wanted to make an example, she'd have to act visibly, and our cameras would catch it. We placed an additional camera, with a battery backup and an angle that caught the whole street. Sheriff Roy arranged for undercover deputies to be in the area, plain clothes, not visible from the street, but close enough to intervene if things got out of hand. There is something weirdly suspenseful about waiting. You think it's going to be a dull stretch of time, but it stretches the way a rubber band does when you pull it thin and taut and ready to snap. The night we decided to test the waters, I didn't sleep. I sat in the living room with a mug of coffee gone cold and watched the streetlights bloom like stars in the fog. I had the little recorder app open on my phone, the cameras online, and a list of names and numbers by the phone if something happened. That's how the mind gets busy with courage. You prepare in lists. Around 2 in the morning, the van rolled up again. It slowed like someone trying to be casual and failed. Headlights off, it slid into the street like its driver thought the night belonged to him. A figure stepped out, walked like he knew the route, approached the decoy, and tried to hook it to a tow cable. It was clumsy, almost fumbling, and then a voice barked, not from the shadows, but from a car across the street. Evelyn. She stepped out with a badge of sorts she'd printed herself, a laminated card she flashed like a badge, and then, in a tone that was equal parts theatrical and fatally certain, said, "You're clearing it. Move." The undercover deputy spoke into his sleeve and told the crew to roll. They revealed themselves at the right moment, like a curtain pulled back. They weren't dramatic about it, no yelling, no cinematic shouting match. Just the quiet, professional way of law enforcement when it has probable cause and a plan. They detained the towing man and the driver who'd been coordinating, and they asked Evelyn to step aside for a conversation. She paused, then complied with an expression that was the human equivalent of a paper mass crumpling. The charges weren't about the truck. They were about conspiracy, about falsifying documents, about coercion, all the legal words that make headlines. But the heart of it felt petty and monumental at once. A woman who had once held neighborhood potlucks and pancake breakfasts had used the machinery of the community to intimidate, to manipulate, to create a spectacle meant to shame. There were forged signatures on notices, invoices for private investigators that traced back to her, texts where she encouraged the tow operator to make an example of certain homeowners. It was vindictive and procedural, petty and dangerous. The deputies took statements, cataloged the evidence, and slowly, methodically, built the paper trail that made the kind of law that slips under community rugs stand up. Afterwards, when the adrenaline thinned into something like exhaustion, neighbors trickled out in their pajamas to compare notes. There were hugs and quiet murmurs, little jokes about how our morning coffee had just become interesting, and some stunned silence from people who'd always thought of Evelyn as someone who just worried about garden borders. She was arrested that day on charges that seemed to start in an HOA newsletter and end in criminal court. She denied everything. Of course people do when they think the story can be rewritten, but the footage was a stubborn, humming witness. The aftermath is the part that really changed us, because people don't often talk about the slow repair of a community. You can remove a person, but you can't remove the memory of how that person made you feel. We had meetings, but this time the meetings were different. We sat down and rewrote the bylaws not to tighten the screws, but to give people more avenues to complain without being crushed. We set up a review committee not dominated by one person. We created clearer rules for hiring third parties and gave the sheriff a seat at the procedural table so there was a public check on private authority. Personally, it forced me to reckon with what legacy means. I could have sold the truck when the lawsuits looked like they might become a thing. I didn't. Instead, I fixed the dent in the passenger door with a hammer and a curse. I sanded, I repainted with Dad's old brush and a few choice songs on the radio. And when I drove it out of the garage on a bright Saturday, the truck looked like the kind of vehicle that had survived a war of manners and had the scars to prove it. It's a small, quiet restoration, the kind we do for ourselves when we decide not to let the world tell our stories. Evelyn's case went to court, which was its own kind of theater. There were public statements about abuse of authority and private letters from sympathetic board members who felt betrayed and called for structural change. She maintained her innocence, and some people still defended her in the way that people defend someone they like because they can't bear the idea of being wrong about them. The judge ultimately issued penalties and a record of culpability, not dramatic prison sentences. That's not the shape of most neighborhood fights, but enough to make the point. There is accountability in institutions, if you push for it, and if the evidence is there. One of the most surreal moments for me was the day the HOA had to return fines they had levied incorrectly against a handful of neighbors. It wasn't just money, it was a public, formal apology with signatures and minutes and resolutions that felt like a small miracle. People who had been nervous to speak up felt heard. People who had been complacent learned that silence can be a decision. And for a brief, electric time, the neighborhood felt like the place we'd meant it to be. Imperfect, human, and slightly more honest. Stories like this rarely end with everything wrapped up. There were fractures. When it rains, water pools in the curve, and for a second you can see the reflection of the street and the faint outline of someone who was once in charge of it. What this whole episode taught me, and I say this not as a moral sermon, but as a tired man who fixed a porch light and learned how to advocate, is that small things are big things. Rules are written by people. People have egos, resentments, ambitions, and sometimes, the apparatus of community can be turned into a weapon against soapbox enemies. We tend to think institutions will save us or institutions will ruin us. In reality, institutions usually do both. That's why being part of a community means paying attention, speaking even when your voice shakes, and documenting the behavior of those who would assume power without accountability. And yes, there were messy ethical lines. People asked, didn't you set up the decoy to lure them into a trap? My answer is what I told Roy in a kitchen with 3 other neighbors. We created transparency. We did not incite wrongdoing. If someone uses their office to intimidate and fabricate authority, that's a different kind of crime than ordinary garden variety disputes. We wanted to be sure what we said in the daylight matched what happened in the dark. That's the difference between making a trap and making a camera. As for Evelyn, in some ways, she became our cautionary tale. In others, a tragic portrait of someone who loved order so much she mistook it for justice. When power gets personal, the two meanings of authority don't align anymore. People like her can be both earnest and cruel. They can believe they're saving the community while shrinking it at the same time. That contradiction is human and uncomfortable. We learn to hold it without giving up on reform. You might be wondering what I'd do differently if this happened again. I'd say I'd have been smarter about the paperwork from the start. Keep copies, save texts, record everything, but beyond the bureaucratic. I tell you to be less ashamed to ask for help. When neighbors started dropping by with coffee, not to gossip, but to say, what can I do? It changed everything. It felt like progress in a way that wasn't neat or categorical, just human and slow. The story isn't about me heroically saving Willowbrook Downs. It's not about me and my truck getting the last line in some viral video. It's about how communities can be both oppressive and redemptive, and how ordinary people, when they look at each other, decide whether they'll tolerate coercion or demand transparency. The truck remains in my garage. Sometimes I sit in it with the engine off, the steering wheel warm under my hands, and think about my dad's laugh while he worked on the carburetor. I think about what legacy means beyond our possessions, about honesty, about neighborliness, and about teaching a community how to be kinder. If you've ever lived under the watchful eye of a homeowner group, or if you've ever felt the small burn of being judged for a lawn or for the kind of car you drive, then maybe you get why I clung to a rusty Chevy and why this whole thing mattered more than it seemed it should. You might find your life edited without your consent. So here's what I'd ask you to do right now. Tell me in the comments, have you ever had a run-in with rules that felt personal? Did you stand up, walk away, or find a way to document the truth?